So this is the first notes video for our 1970s unit. So like I put down here, questions 1 through 23. Use this video and the notes on this video to answer those on your study guide, which again, go back to that document I put up. That's going to be due April 2nd, which is Thursday before midnight, so by 11:59 p.m. All right, so you basically got 23 questions to get done here in the next 2, 3-ish days. All right, so pay attention to those due dates and get this done. So you can see, obviously, we're talking here about Nixon. I kind of like this quote from him up here because remember, Nixon hates the media. All right, we'll get back to that here in a second, but he always did, going back to the whole JFK televised debates, right, thing and the awkwardness, and Nixon was sweaty, but JFK looked good, and, Nixon needed makeup and, stuttered over his words, kind of like I am on this video, and, but yeah, so we'll get back to his media paranoia. That's kind of what we're talking about here, and then the problems that we had in the 70s with some of the economic type stuff, but going back a little bit here to 1968, this was such a crazy year, right? Remember 1968, Martin Luther King gets assassinated, Robert F. Kennedy gets assassinated, Wallace has this little run for president down south. Remember, he was the hardcore segregationist guy from Alabama that the Deep South just rallies around and votes for president here. We had the violence between cops and protesters at the Democratic National Convention, right? Humphrey ended up being the nominee out of that, but Nixon wins pretty handily here. A lot of stuff happened in '68, and Nixon's really at the forefront of all of it. So here's broken down by state, not by county, but you can see Nixon won everything in blue, even though he's a Republican. I know the colors are a little goofy there. But what Nixon did very smartly, and he really starts a trend for the Republican Party starting in 1968, is he starts catering to different kind of people than what had traditionally been Republican voters up to that point. And he calls them the silent majority. You can see here in this little campaign quote thing. He also uses the term real. That'll be a theme in this unit, and obviously for politicians, even going forward, everybody likes to either call themselves, well, I'm a real American, or I want the real Americans, quote unquote, to vote for me. And I don't necessarily know what that means. It doesn't really mean anything, but it's just a really good word for politicians to throw out. For Nixon, he used it to describe this silent majority, which also describes them too, like it says, people that feel forgotten. Now think about throughout the 60s who had been making the news, who had been making a lot of the noise, right? It's the protesters, it's the people that are against Vietnam, it's the hippies, right? It's the people that Nixon hated and thought were phony and thought were killing the war effort and that really didn't appreciate America and that were unpatriotic, right? The kids at Kent State, right? The backlash to those kind of protests, when some of those people are like, well, I think it's about time some of them got shot, and everyone's like, oh, okay. But there were a lot of people that just feel like, man, all the attention is on young kids and war and protesters. And what about, the white, older, lower class, blue collar workers that are not in the news, are not protesting, they're just going to work, they're just living their lives. Nixon's like, I know you feel like you've been forgotten, and I'm telling you, I see you. You're my people. I'm with you. You're the silent majority. It's a small fraction of Americans that are making all this noise of protesting and being hippies and da 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 da. I know that you're uncomfortable with the 60s and what they've brought, and I'm telling you, I'm your guy. Really smart campaign, actually, and it's something that politicians, especially Republican politicians, have been doing ever since 1968. Okay, find people that feel like society is going the other way from what their values are and cater to those people. Reagan's going to do the same thing in 1980 he's going to basically do what Nixon did, but on steroids. Okay, we'll get to that here towards the end of the unit, but that's the silent majority. Okay, older white blue collar voters who felt like they've been drowned out by the hippies and the protesters and the Vietnam struggle, and it's just like, man, is anybody going to represent me and pay attention to me and what I want and how I'm feeling? Nixon was their guy. All right. Now, Nixon jumps in to, remember he ran his whole campaign saying, we'll get out of Vietnam, we'll get out of Vietnam, peace with honor, peace with honor. But he had kind of a rough start with that. So this guy is Daniel Ellsberg, and you can see from his quote here, he's going to be, well, you can call him a whistleblower, you can call him a leak. There's a lot of terms you could put to this, but basically, he was working within the government. I can't remember if he's FBI or CIA, but basically, he takes these documents called that become known as the Pentagon Papers, okay, and he basically figures out through reading them that the government has basically been lying to Americans about how Vietnam's going, either what's happening in Vietnam or how many people we had in Vietnam or just how successful or unsuccessful things in Vietnam were going. And he's like, shouldn't Americans know this information? Okay, so he illegally, mind you, takes this classified information and gives it to the New York Times and to the Washington Post also. Okay, and so, really, he basically just had a problem with what the government was keeping from the American people. Now, just because the newspapers have this information, should they print it? Should it become public knowledge is the big question. Are there things that Americans should or should not know? I think Ellsberg probably falls on the side of saying you, as a citizen and, as a democracy in the government that you choose and you vote for, you probably have a right to know everything. Okay? Nixon's not really going to see it that way. So, quick video, be looking for the answers to these questions here.
The war in Vietnam tears America apart. Anti-war activists take to the streets, and the government reacts with tear gas and bayonets. Unknown to the American public, a secret report was commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The highly classified document contains evidence of lying by the government about the reasons the war is being fought and the probability of success. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg, one of the select group of Pentagon analysts who wrote the classified study, turns against the war.
They were prepared to prolong a war, and expand a war at each step, rather than to lose it, and Nixon was the same.
I want to end this war. The American people want to end this war.
Ellsberg believes that Nixon's pledge to get out of Vietnam is not to be trusted.
All I could do was to put out top-secret documents of history showing every previous president acted the way I claim Nixon is acting. Read this and see if you don't think you should look very closely at what Nixon is doing. Challenge him. Have hearings, call witnesses, find out whether he really means to get out.
Ellsberg leaks the secret documents to the New York Times. Editors have to decide whether to publish them. It causes a heated debate within the paper.
Went on for 3 months, and all the time we were examining it, meetings took place, and they got extremely tense at some times because one or two of the editors didn't want us to print it. They felt it was not right. Nothing like this had been done. Did we have the right to do it? Did we have the right to withhold it?
The decision to make the papers public is not an easy one. Stakes are high.
Because, if we were wrong and this was something that hurt a single soldier, we would live with it forever.
Sunday, June 13th, 1971. The New York Times begins its explosive series based on the Pentagon Papers.
I felt that we were doing our duty. I knew the government would have a heart attack.
The Nixon administration is outraged. They say printing classified documents in the New York Times risks national security.
We subscribe to the Bill of Rights, but they are not absolute in any circumstance.
The Attorney General orders the New York Times to stop, but the paper refuses and lands in federal court.
So here's the issue, right? You have this classified information, and yet the Constitution, the First Amendment says, well, there's freedom of the press. So if you have this information, you are therefore free to print it. The Nixon administration said, no, well, this is a national security risk. You can't do that. This is classified. And so eventually it's going to go to the Supreme Court, like I said. Basically, the administration, if we're going to answer, so I would say the answer to this question is national security. The answer to this question is they shut it down. Okay, they basically ordered the New York Times and the Washington Post says you can't do this. Okay, sorry, you are not allowed to print this. If you do, you'll, you know, face legal punishment. So it goes to Supreme Court. Supreme Court actually says, hey, we're going to go with the First Amendment on this one. You didn't prove that there's a national security risk with this kind of information, so we're going to side with the newspapers. And it does get printed, and it really hurts Nixon's, I don't know, the way he was framing the war, the public no longer bought. Okay. And so really the printing or the media and the newspapers win that battle, and it just makes Nixon hate the media that much more, and it makes the public turn against the Vietnam War that much more. And so Nixon, in a response to this, who again hates the media with all the passion in the world, he gets these guys together and he calls them his plumbers. Now, you look at these guys, you know, in their trench coats and gloves, and they kind of look like they're going to murder you. It wasn't quite to that point, but what does a plumber do? I mean, when do you call a plumber? When you have a leak? So, you know, these guys' job is to quote unquote plug leaks. In other words, anybody that's talking to the media, anybody in the administration, anybody working in the White House, anybody in the departments that Nixon can control or on his staff that he really can control, make sure they are not out there talking to the media. He hates the media for the Pentagon Papers thing. He hates them because they think that he framed that whole debate with JFK and they really screwed him out of the 1960 election. He blames all their coverage of the Vietnam War and the violence they were putting on TV, saying, how can we win a war when the public's getting turned off by blood and guts every night on the news? That's a media problem. Covering the protesters all the time just helps spread them and kills the war effort as well and hurts the draft. He had all kinds of reasons to hate him. And then, of course, the Pentagon Papers thing makes it even worse. So these guys were there to quote unquote stop leaks. Now, what that means is they would actively try to find dirt on people that worked for Nixon for possible blackmail later on. So that if they did go talk to the media, you know, Nixon could be like, don't do that again, or I'll tell whoever blah, blah, blah about your affair or your illegitimate child or whatever it might be, you know, dirt that people had. Or, okay, they also might follow you home at night, you know, and if you make sure you don't, you know, go from the White House to the bar between the White House and your home and drink too much and then start talking to some pretty newspaper reporter or something like that. Okay, but that was their job. Make sure that whatever the media gets is super controlled. Okay, okay, we'll get back to that here in a second and probably get more to that in our next video about Watergate. But stagflation. Okay, so I know I'm kind of giving it away here with this picture, but there's going to be economic problems in the 70s for a lot of reasons. This is going to basically be the phenomenon that happened. Now, this does not happen in our economy very often, but it's a combination of the words stagnation and inflation. Here's the problem, okay? Businesses were basically getting slowed down as far as growth and stuff goes by things that were out of their control. So if a business makes a product, I mean, the prices of their product is going to reflect how much it cost to make that product, right? Well, if fuel prices or energy prices for the electricity or to make the product or to ship those products is going up, that's not the business owner's fault. That's just a systematic problem, but it's going to make them raise their price, right? Because it costs more to make their stuff if fuel is high. Same thing with insurance costs that they don't really control, or taxes that they don't get to control as a small or medium or even large business owner necessarily. So in other words, this slowed down the growth of businesses and also cause them to raise their products, because if the cost is going up, they need to raise the price of selling it. That's what inflation is. So you put that together and you have stagflation. The business can neither grow and they're also raising their price. Usually it's the other way around. If a business is struggling, or has a product they have to get rid of, you'll lower the price, right? And that's economics 101. But here it was the inverse, and that is not a good combination. Okay? And the census started to give people, and the economy won't be the only reason for this down here in yellow, but by the 70s, we were removed a full decade or even more from the 50s, and people started feeling like, man, remember how awesome the 50s were? This is kind of when the 50s became an awesome thing. Remember the show Happy Days? I don't know if anyone ever seen Happy Days, but it's a show from the 70s but set back in the 50s called Happy Days. Yeah, so even in the 70s, people were like, man, the 50s were great. Wish we'd get back to that. And it wasn't even that long ago. Okay, so this will go into it economically. We'll also go into it for some other reasons too, but we'll get back to that later in the unit. So said the fuel costs are going up. Well, here's what happened with the fuel or the oil where all gasoline comes from. So basically, like I said, we have supported Israel in the Middle East. We had a big hand in getting it established in like 1948. I think after World War II, after the Holocaust, we kind of wanted Jewish people to have a country of their own. So we were instrumental with the UN in creating Israel. It's a democracy in the Middle East, so we support it like crazy with weapons and money. Well, Egypt and Israel were fighting for like 30 some years. And in 1973, basically a lot of Middle Eastern countries resented Israel even being there, which means they also didn't like the fact that we were helping them. So with our involvement in this war, Middle Eastern countries basically just set up an embargo and said, hey, we know you rely on our oil. We know what our most valued resource and commodity is. It's oil. And guess what? You ain't getting it anymore. Okay. So this just destroyed our gas reserves and the amount of fuel that we had. And so you can see they put limits on how much you could pump. Here, this down here says even numbers only. They went by license plates. If your license plate ended with an even number, you could get gas that day, and then they would do odd numbers the next day. So it was that bad. Here's a big line just to fill up. So this was a crisis. I mean, that's not really like, an overstatement. Okay. So OPEC, okay, is the conglomerate or whatever you want to call it, right? But it's basically a bunch of Middle Eastern countries that have a ton of oil. Okay, they all pretty much got together, really in the 1960s, but really they got, I don't know, more strict about it in the 70s, saying, listen, it's not going to do us any good to keep undercutting each other, whereas, we don't want to sell the U.S. oil for below this price, and then here comes Saudi Arabia and undercuts them. They basically all get together and say, we're going to actually benefit from this more if we work together on selling the word our oil. Okay. But what this did to us is it shifted in how we started to think about oil and gas in the 70s, and it's really been that way ever since now for over, for almost 50 years. Okay, made us do two big things. Okay, we had to become more efficient, and this is really where the 55 mile per hour stuff on highways comes in. 55 is not really about safety. It is more about fuel efficiency, at least of the types of engines that were being produced in cars back then. That's what the 55 mile per hour is about. Maybe a little bit about safety, but it was more about fuel efficiency, to be quite honest with you. Okay. And the other thing we really had to do was find more within our own borders, right? Now that makes sense. If you can't get it overseas or if it costs more, well, we need to start drilling where we got it here. And so we start drilling in Alaska and building the pipeline to ship it on down here. We start drilling in the Gulf of Mexico and stuff like that. So remember, this is the height of the Cold War, and Nixon is trying to get out of Vietnam. With the unpopularity of Vietnam, he's trying to do two things. He's trying to get other people in the world to be bigger players on the world stage, not rely on us or rely on the USSR, if you're the communist world, to do everything. Okay? So this superpower dynamic isn't good. It just makes us point at them and them point at us. We flex back and forth, and it becomes a mess. We need other countries to step up, help us out on the democracy side, resist communism. So we want to balance power. Okay, and also he knows deep down that Vietnam was such a disaster, and the draft is so unpopular that he can't keep near as many men in uniform as what he might want to continue to fight the Cold War. People want the troops home. Okay? They're not after these conflicts by the 70s and 80s. So what we're going to do is rely on our allies. We really want to get Japan to help control Asia. We're going to have Iran, which we'll talk about more later on this unit. Iran to help in the Middle East, along with Israel, of course, but Iran, as far as a Muslim country, want to help us too. Not so it's not a target on Israel, and South Africa to help in Africa. So trying to get our allies to do more was really his plan, and it made sense given what he was working with and what Americans would allow or not allow him to do. So he's going to do more PR type efforts, and this is where Forrest Gump comes in. I know it sucks we can't watch the whole movie, but the part where he's like a ping pong stud, I mean, he's not a real person, obviously, but they send him somewhere, the government does, with his ping pong skill. That actually happened.
It happens. Never, ever take your eye off the ball.
For some reason, ping pong came very natural to me.
See, any idiot can play.
So I started playing it all the time. I played ping pong even when I didn't have anyone to play ping pong with. The hospital's people said it made me look like a duck in water, whatever that means. Even Lieutenant Dan would come and watch me play. I played ping pong. I thought I was going back to Vietnam, but instead they decided the best way for me to fight the communists was to play ping pong. So I was in the special services, traveling around the country, cheering up all them wounded veterans and showing them how to play ping pong. I was so good that some years later, the Army decided that I should be on the All-America ping pong team. We were the first Americans to visit the land of China in like a million years or something like that. Somebody said world peace was in our hands, but all I did was play ping pong. When I got home...
So that really happened. Okay? This is part of Nixon's philosophy of just doing little relational things to try to lessen tensions. The whole brinkmanship thing we talked about a couple units ago, with the analogy of the rope with the knot in it, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was only less than 10 years or so removed from that. So if we can do little things to build a relationship, with China, with the USSR, with Vietnam, with Cuba, whatever it is, great. Okay? And sending the ping pong team was actually a way to do that, and it really was one of the first Americans to go to China. And like you said, not a million years, but in a while. Okay. And also the SALT Treaty came down the pipe. And so this is really the first on paper agreement with the USSR about nuclear weapons, about limiting it. Basically, I mean, we basically just said, like, we're not going to build anymore, you don't build anymore, high five. Now, a lot of Americans, rolled their eyes at this because how do we really know that they're not building anymore? It's not like we were necessarily sending in, people to go check because they weren't allowing that inside their country or anything. But so even if you're like, pessimistic about it, if it actually worked or not, at least it was a written agreement on paper, right? I think for Nixon and for Americans, it did show maybe a little bit of progress in Cold War relations. The fear of dying in a nuclear blast was still very much alive, but hey, at least we're not building any more nukes, yeah? So, okay, a couple things to wrap this up. So, also in the 70s, and this will flow into your next assignment that I'm going to put in classroom, that advertising assignment. I'm going to have you look at a few different commercials going into this. By the 70s, there were just not a lot of laws or regulations around how things could be advertised as well. Now, we talked about this during the Gilded Age, like way back in September. We had like the little kid advertisement for cocaine drops, and like just the ridiculousness of what companies could get away with. I mean, we had a few laws on the books, but in general, by the 70s, it was still kind of lacking. Ralph Nader, wrote this book. Really is going after the Chevrolet Corvair especially, and he looked at a bunch of lawsuits because he just really the book is about all the different ways that car companies had resisted safety, regulations and even just basic things that we think about like seat belts and things, let alone all the stuff that they have now with airbags and you know just I don't know all the stuff. I don't really have new cars, so don't ask me. I'm too poor. But okay, basically he wanted more corporate accountability, and by the 70s there was a push for this, and he gets some things done. Also, along with this, he helped with the creation of the EPA, which Nixon signs into law also, which we still have today. These things are related, as in Nader, is like, what are companies doing with their waste, with the clean air, clean water? And so, one with corporate accountability flows into the EPA type stuff. And then also OSHA, our people, do they have a way to be safe on the job? Are companies providing training for how to be safe on the job? Okay, I know OSHA regulations can go overboard sometimes, but it's probably good that we have it in general. Okay, last slide here. So with the EPA getting created, right, environmental issues become much more on people's radar in the 70s. And even going back to the 60s, of course, hippie culture had an emphasis on regulations for environment and being out in nature and things like that. But we had the oil crisis, which made people think, well, as part of being more efficient about our gas, what if we're able to get off of oil? Okay, you had oil spills, especially I think it's off the coast of California. Okay, and then you have the EPA getting created, and obviously advertising like this. The Crying Indian commercial is one you could probably look up on YouTube if you wanted to. But we also created the first Earth Day as far as this goes also. So you have EPA, Earth Day, a few disasters with the environment, and with the oil crisis going up, Americans thought, is there a way to be cleaner? Is there a way for alternative forms of energy? Okay? And when we get to Jimmy Carter, he's going to bring that plan into the mix, but it's really going to get turned down in some pretty quick ways, unfortunately. All right, so that's it for these notes. I think use it for questions 1 to 23. Okay, and be looking for the next video, but make sure you get that part of your study guide done by the due dates, and take care of yourself. Till next time.